Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Lei Ding from Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. Welcome to today's webinar on place-based strategies. This is the second session in our Research for Equity in Recovery series, which is co-hosted by PenRUR, the Upjohn Institute, and the Philadelphia Fed. Our goal with this webinar series is to create a platform for us to discuss up-to-date research and best practices that could inform an equitable recovery from the pandemic crisis. I want to start with the standard disclaimer. The information, analysis, and conclusions set forth are those of the panelists and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. Before I hand this over to the moderator of this session, I just want to mention a few housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded, and we will post the presentations and other supporting materials to our website shortly. During the session, we also encourage you to use the Q&A function that you can find in your Zoom toolbar to ask questions. We want this webinar to be an interactive dialogue as well, I think, with the technology we have. Last but not least, moderating this session is Susan Wachter, who is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and also co-director of PenRUR. Thank you, Susan, for putting this wonderful panel together, and I will hand this over to you now.
Thank you, Lei.
Hi, Susan.
Hello, Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here today. This is Susan Wachter of the Penn Institute for Urban Research, and I would like to welcome all our attendees to this webinar, which is a third in a series that is jointly sponsored by the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank, the Penn Institute for Urban Research, and the Upjohn Institute. This webinar, which is the second in a series, will focus on equitable recovery and the role of place-based strategies in equitable recovery. In today's webinar, each of our panelists will speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll respond to each other's presentations, and then we will turn to you, the audience, for your questions. We have more than 400 attendees, so we will try to get to your questions, but obviously it will be hard to get to all of them. As we respond to the COVID crisis and to the social inequities that the crisis has put into stark relief, it is not too soon to think about equity and recovery. Today's webinar will think about solutions to the inequities of the landscape of economic growth and the need for shared prosperity in recovery. Each of our panelists has expertise in this area and will enable us to think together about the necessary solutions. Particularly in our past period of growth, the growth was very concentrated spatially across the country in areas of opportunity, and we will hear more about the very defined and localization of the opportunity for growth historically. And at the same time, distressed areas have lacked reinvestment. We will begin with Tim Bartik. And Tim Bartik, who's a senior economist at Upjohn Institute, will talk about both distressed areas and more generally the need for opportunities presented by place-based strategies for equitable recovery. Tim, will you start us off, please?
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to the Philadelphia Fed and to Penn Institute for Urban Research for co-sponsoring this session. So what I'm going to argue is that place-based job creation policies should be used to help economically distressed local labor markets in the U.S. But do we need a lot of reforms to what we're currently doing to improve things? Whoops. So why do we, what's the problem? Why do we need such policies? Well, one, as Susan already pointed out, there are big disparities across local labor markets. So I have a statistic here looking at the employment rate for prime age workers between the ages of 25 and 54. There are big differences across the US between local labor markets. Not only are there big differences, but these differences are very persistent. So the same, that there is some change over time, but generally speaking, most of the distressed areas in the year 2000 were still distressed prior to this pandemic recession. The other thing to point out is the pandemic recession is likely to worsen the situation. When we look historically at how local labor markets became distressed, a lot of that occurs due to a local area being hit particularly hard by a recession. There is research that shows that when an area suffers a higher employment loss in a recession, it may get back to the prior growth track, but it does not necessarily recover that employment. Its employment rate is permanently depressed relative to what it otherwise would be without that severe recession. So I expect the pandemic recession to result in more regional disparities, more regional distress than we had entering into it. Now, the reason why I'm concerned about this is that these local labor market problems have very high social costs. Workers who are out of work, they lose their skills. There's increased crime problems, increased problems with substance abuse, family problems. The kids growing up have more problems if the labor market is troubled. And then the fiscal stress on local government reduces the quality of local public services. And in fact, it is these social costs that help explain why these problems persist. If an area has a low employment rate, various changes happen in the labor market and in the social order of the area that tend to cause the problems to persist over time. What is the solution? Well, you commonly hear, let's move people to where the jobs are. Let's have migration subsidies. Well, I don't think that's a good solution because a couple of reasons. The first reason why it's not a great solution is when you look at how much people respond to migration subsidies, it's hard to induce more than a few additional 2 or 3% of the population move out. People have ties to their home places. They care about their home. The other thing to note is that moving people out of distressed areas does not help the people left behind. In fact, the research suggests that if 10% of the population moves out of a distressed place, that reduces employment by 10%. So the people left behind are just as poor, their labor market problems are just as acute as they were before. Why does this occur? Well, population moving out reduces demand for goods and services, it reduces construction demand, it reduces housing wealth, it reduces entrepreneurship. All these things leave the areas left behind no better off, maybe even worse off. So trying to subsidize people to move out of Flint, Michigan does not help people left behind in Flint. On the other hand, the research shows that moving jobs to people can work. So for example, the empirical estimates suggest that if we increase an area's employment by 10%, in the long run, after 10 years or so, the employment to population ratio will increase by at least 2%. And this persists as far as we can tell for 10, 15, 20 years, maybe even longer than that. That implies, by the way, that job creation has extremely high benefits in areas. By raising the employment rate, if you figure out what implications that would have for earnings over time, the present value of the increased earnings per job would exceed $200,000 per job. Furthermore, these effects on employment rates are about half again greater, at least, in economically distressed areas. That is, in areas where there are a lot of non-employed people, and this makes common sense and is backed by research, creating jobs has more of an effect on the employment rate. And this suggests, by the way, that this is not just an equity issue helping distressed areas. If we can reallocate jobs to distressed areas where the non-employed people are, we actually may be able to increase the overall national employment rate in a sustainable way without inflationary pressures. So that very much fits into the Fed's mandate of trying to pursue non-inflationary policies to boost employment. So what's the problem with current policies? Well, current policies in the U.S. mostly rely on state and local tax incentives, business tax incentives. Now, business tax incentives can work, but they only tip, the research suggests that the average business tax incentive only tips about 10% of business location decisions. And if you add up what that means in terms of the cost per job created, the cost per job created is has a present value of about 200,000. Now, I already said that the benefits might be over 200,000. So yeah, they can have benefits greater than costs, but they're pretty closely balanced. How can we do better? Well, one, we can target businesses with higher multipliers. That includes high tech. High tech multipliers in high tech areas are probably twice as great as regular multipliers. That cuts the cost per job created in half. And in fact, the research suggests, and this will be important to later presentations, that in fact, high tech multipliers are high not only in Silicon Valley, but also in any area that has a somewhat above average high tech percentage. There are a broad range of areas with high tech multipliers. Other things you can do, as I said, targeting distressed areas will have a higher benefit cost ratio because it raises the employment rate more, or you can use policies to try to link economic development with the local non-employed through the local workforce system, through encouraging companies to use that local workforce system through so-called first source hiring requirements, or by using customized job training programs. We also can try policies that are cheaper than handing out cash. If you do things like provide business advice through manufacturing extension programs or small business development centers, you provide customized job training, you do land development policies, all of those infrastructure, all of those policies have costs of less than $50,000 per job created. So 4 times as cost effective as the average cash incentive. So essentially what we need to do is to do more targeting in the business, target the unemployed, and also use strategies that are more cost effective. Well, this can be done by state and local governments on their own. State and local governments could take the money they currently spend on incentives, which is about $50 billion a year, and they could instead devote more money to these more cost-effective types of investments in public services to business. They could target distressed areas to a much greater extent. Alternatively, this could be done by the federal government. The federal government could decide to follow the European Union and limit discretionary incentives to large firms for large projects. And you could vary the limits depending on whether the area was distressed or non-distressed. And the federal government could have a federal block grant to help distressed areas. What would that cost? Well, if you did something like the TVA for the kind of the bottom 15 or 20% of the US population, you could provide TVA level aid of about $300 per capita for about $15 billion a year. That would be the cost. So it's not certainly within the range of feasibility of the federal government, and for that matter, it's within the range of feasibility what state and local governments can do. I vary from day to day depending on whether I think federal intervention is more likely to be politically feasible or state and local reforms are more likely to be politically feasible. But in either case, what we need to recognize is that there's a substantial national interest in increasing job growth in economically distressed areas, that this would significantly boost employment rates, would have very high benefits, and would have a very high benefit cost ratio if we pursued the more efficient policies that would target high multiplier businesses, target jobs to non-employed, target distressed areas, and use some of these public services to business that are more effective, perhaps more complicated to administer, but are more cost effective than simply handing out cash to large firms. So let me stop there and we can move on to the 2 other presentations.
Thank you, Tim. for that excellent laying out of the landscape on distressed areas and the substantial federal interest and national interest in local job growth in distressed areas. We will now turn to Simon Johnson in a moment, who will talk about the growing U.S. urban divide, causes and implications. And after Simon Johnson, we will turn to Mark Muro. Simon Johnson is a professor at MIT, and Mark Muro is at Brookings, and they both have shown in their previous work and pointed out the serious disparate regional growth outcomes of the past. The characterization of the past growth is not simply at very different levels, but also the results of this disparate growth patterns, the equity and efficiency costs of these patterns. Simon will lay out the costs and potential solutions to begin with. Simon, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Susan. So Tim has made, I think, a number of very important points with which I completely agree about the disparity of economic development around the United States over the past 3 or 4 decades. I'll go through that quickly and then spend a bit more time on potential solutions, which will, as Susan said, as you will see, link up quite nicely with also what Mark is going to say. So there are various ways to divide up the regional pattern of growth that we've seen within the United States in recent decades. And also think about where we live. Certainly, if you think about mega cities on the east and west coast, I'll show you a map in a moment. These are relatively high productivity. They certainly, before the COVID crisis, were doing quite well in terms of incomes. We'll talk about population and job creation in a moment. We have a lot of Americans who are living in places that were less dynamic, and about 50 million people living in small towns and completely rural counties that have participated less in some of the stronger economic growth that we've experienced. Okay, so this is a map that illustrates this, looking at the kinds of jobs that are created by sector, where you can see Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, basically on the West Coast, Boston, New York, and depending how you measure, Washington, D.C. on the East Coast is participating fully in the tech-led growth that we've experienced in recent decades. Now, they're not the only places, and that's the point this map makes clear, but they're also places that have disproportionately benefited. So next slide. And this is a new pattern. This is not the way the US used to grow. Tim referred to Flint, Michigan, which of course was at the heart of an extremely prosperous area, and just one example of a non-coastal metropolitan statistical area that had high income. Certainly the auto cluster in Michigan did very well for a long period of time. What we've seen more recently is prosperity moving to the coast. Next slide. You can see this across a variety of measures. So this is absolutely leaning towards the technology side of Tim's story, but nevertheless, we think rather important in terms of dynamic. You look at where patterns happen. Look at where venture capital is located. It's extremely concentrated. Next slide. And this is reflected, of course, in house prices. Now, house prices may be adjusting somewhat in face of the crisis. I think not so much, actually. Certainly relative prices. And what's really striking and interesting here is that the top cities, the most prosperous places by this definition, had house prices in 1980 that were just a little bit above the national average. Now they're dramatically above the national average. And the reason for that, presumably in part, is that you have many restrictions on building higher density housing in those relatively prosperous places. Next slide. Now, of course, what happened in American history, go back to the 19th century or even earlier if you want, and certainly well into the 20th century, is when a town boomed because there was a shift in the location of population, or a particular technology took off, or people just wanted to go live in Los Angeles because it was warmer. You see there was a big shift in population to those areas. That is not what's been happening more recently. Next slide. So here again are some cuts on the places where people live and the places where we have different kinds of business. Look at the East Coast tech superstars. Those are the 3 cities I talked about, or the West Coast tech superstars. They're not the places with the high population growth in recent decades. Actually, that's more in these big cities over 2 million population, which certainly have some pluses. And look at where the population is declining or not growing rapidly. It's down at the side, at the end of the small towns and rural areas. Next slide. And if you break it down by counties, this is really quite dramatic, that there are 80% of counties, so it's obviously leaning towards rural areas, there's 150 million people that have had a decline in, roughly speaking, working age population, or age 25 to 54, over the last 10 years for which we have data. So people moving out of their birth states by age 30, particularly if they're college educated, this is one element, but only one element of the growing divide across education and geography and perhaps other dimensions in the United States at the moment. Next slide, please. So you can see this, for example, in terms of where people move after they go to university. People who go to University of Chicago, according to the Wall Street Journal, that's tracked this very carefully, tend to move from Chicago to the East and West Coast and a little bit to other places such as Dallas and Houston. Next slide. If you take MIT, just as an example, relatively few MIT graduates move to Chicago. They move to other places on the East Coast or to those tech hubs on the West Coast. Next slide. Now, in a book that we published last year, John Gruber and I, the book's called Jumpstarting America, John Gruber and I proposed or identified, based on some objective criteria, places that could become next generation tech hubs. Now, exactly what you mean by a tech hub, how much technology would be there, how big they would be, of course, those are all good questions that we can discuss further. But these are places that have a lot of college-educated people. They have relatively low house prices. There's room to build there, presumably. They have over 100,000 potential workers. And we're not suggesting they're the next so-called Silicon Valley. I think those dreams usually turn out not to be entirely accurate. But these are places that I think can fit within the framework that Tim was proposing in terms of places where the jobs can move to people. And these are places that we think are relatively easy movement of jobs to people, because the people are there, the conditions in those places are actually pre-COVID rather good. And if you don't like our index, or if your hometown is missing from there, you can go on our website, jumpstartingamerica.com, and you can adjust the weights and other ways in which we compose the index, and you can see for yourself how that affects relative rankings of these various places. So a lot of potential, a deep geographic bench, if you like, for the United States with regard to job creation and technology development. Next slide. And we are very much on the side, I think, with Mark, emphasizing that we need to boost productivity over a longer period of time in the United States. The decline in productivity growth in recent decades has a number of causes. Next slide. But certainly contributing to those is a decline in public, meaning federal government support for R&D. That's come down a lot since the mid-1960s. We have venture capital-based tech development, but venture capital likes to stay pretty close to the home of venture capital, which is particularly on the West Coast. We have this restricted supply of housing, so these high productivity places are not pulling workers in like they would have done in previous historical episodes. And there is what's been called the lost Marie Curie's and lost Einstein issue, which is very smart young people who don't get connected to high quality education and don't start a tech business because they happen to be randomly born in a place that doesn't have as much activity around the tech sector. Now, this was something we've addressed. This is something we addressed before in the United States. After the launch of the Sputnik satellite by the Soviet Union in 1957, the U.S. passed bipartisan legislation, the National Defense Education Act of 1958, that tried to increase access to science and technology and related employment opportunities across the entire country. So the proposal we have in Jumpstarting America is, let's do that again. Let's have a big push on R&D, led by the federal government, emphasizing the complementarity between that and the private sector. So commercialization is very important. Universities matter in that, and Mark's going to emphasize that, and I think he's absolutely correct. But perhaps we can broaden out beyond places that already have well-established leading research universities. That's to be discussed. And if we don't do this, if we don't push back hard, and if we don't invest more in R&D, we're not going to get the boost in productivity growth, and we're not going to be able to resist, I would suggest, through COVID and after COVID, the continued polarization of this country. Next slide, please. So right now, or compare with 1960, in 1960, the wages that existed in Santa Clara County, for example, in the Silicon Valley area, were such that somebody who was working as a janitor in the Deep South would have felt, from a monetary perspective, it was quite compelling to move there because the wage differential exceeded the difference in living costs. Now that's not true, and that's because of housing costs. So this is a key indication, a one particular piece of data, but a key indication of why the people are not able to move to the jobs, and why you need to move the jobs closer to the people, just as Tim said. Next slide. And we can talk at great length, if you like, in the Q&A about the implications, for example, for the employment to population ratio, which I think is a crude but key indicator of how different states are doing with regard to job creation, particularly attractive jobs for people in prime working age groups. Next slide. So this trend, the polarization, the movement of the good opportunities to the coast, and the lack of people's ability to participate in that form of growth, it's real, it's lasting. I think it's going to persist through the COVID crisis, to be honest, although it's hard to know exactly what will happen to distance and to people's preference about exactly where they work and how companies regard the necessary or desired location of their workforce. I think this polarization is going to remain. We could push back against it, we can push back against it, and I think proposals to massively scale up R&D, to make that productive, to plug that into the private sector and into productivity. That's my 10-minute bell. I think that those proposals should be fully supported. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon, for laying out how very different growth has been from historical movement to opportunity, and how in recent decades there's no longer movement to opportunity. People historically moved to jobs, but no longer. Today, in the areas that are job rich, housing costs are blocking such movement. And the need for more R&D in response, and a spatial lens for the deployment of R&D. We will now turn to Mark Muro, who is Senior Fellow and Policy Director at the Brookings Institution, to present his views on the growing spatial divide in opportunity. Mark, please go ahead.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Susan, and thank you, Leigh, Tim, Susan, for inviting us, and Tim and Simon for great simpatico remarks and company. As we focus more on equity among people, we all need to, focus more on places too. So a real shout out to the bank for putting this together. So what I'm going to do is take up Susan's request earlier that I say a little about the nature of the divergence problem, or give another perspective on what I think runs through the outstanding work of my colleagues, and why it matters now. And then after that, I'd like to just touch on a proposal that Rob Atkinson of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation and I advanced last winter at Brookings. Very simpatico and parallel to some of Simon's thinking as well. So, but let's just look at what's happening first. A different perspective, a complementary perspective. I want to be clear too. I'm not saying, and none of us are saying, that regional variations and divides are new under the sun. It's been obvious forever that cities and regions perform at different levels, given their different starting attributes, whether it's geography, resources, or size. We assume a degree of variation too. I think as a nation, Americans are tolerant of a lot of variation, some of which might even be beneficial, but not all of it. And yet in recent years, it's become clear that something different and disturbing has been happening. And the economics profession, I think, in the last decade has become quite aware of this. Most notably, an epidemic of what we call regional divergence became unmistakable as the economic fortunes of those superstar coastal cities that Simon was discussing continued to really pull away from the fortunes of dozens of secondary metros, like Kansas City, say, where hundreds of often smaller metros and rural areas, those especially, I think, in the midst of Tim's proposal and mapping and proposal, have been left behind, often in real distress. And what you can see here, I mean, the big picture, this is, looking back to 1970 or so, through much of the 20th century, well-recognized, welfare maximizing market forces tended to reduce wage investment and business formation disparities. Simon touched on this too. It's almost hard to remember this period when the working of the economy tended to narrow divides, and the economy ensured this very welcome backdrop condition of convergence among communities and regions. Think of the catch-up of the New South in the 1970s, right? But in the 1980s, that trend began to break down as, in my view, I'm probably a bit of a hedgehog on this, maybe over-insistent on it as a crucial answer to the riddle, but innovation and information moved to the center of the economic activity of the country, and I think, and really the world, and began to change citing. Intense new demands for skills and insights increased the value of agglomeration economies, increasing self-reinforcing dynamics that benefited, again, a short list of core, often coastal regions with often high standards of living, which began to pull away from cities and metros. These places offered pools of increasingly skilled workers. Amid these conditions, as you can see here, convergence trend began to break down and gave way to divergence. As you see that blue line begin to pull away, that's a top tier of high-tech metro areas like Boston, the Bay Area, and Seattle. This is a measure of wages, which is what we show here. And in no domain, what's more, have these trends been starker than in the innovation sector. Here we define it as a portfolio of 13, essential R&D and STEM intensive industries that we looked at in our new paper. But again, you can see the top 20 metropolitan areas selected each year. So this is kind of a rolling average. And the top 20 or 5% of metros for innovation industry job growth, that blue line, have far outstripped the next 20 places, the orange line, the next 60, and then the next 60, and the bottom 75% of places. So there's almost a rank order sorting of places as digital and innovation dynamics began to hold sway. The result is an epidemic of imbalance, I think we could say, epitomized by the hyper-concentration, the hyper-concentration of industry activity. Here, looking at this map, you can see far more red dots depicting metro area losses of those coveted innovation jobs, and a relatively small list, short list of blue winners in this dynamic. And you can see, far from spreading out as we've hoped it would, the most critical sector has been concentrating in the Seattles of the world, the Bay Area, San Francisco, San Jose, San Diego, and of course, Boston. Most notably, those 5 innovation metros I just mentioned accounted for, by our calculations, 90% of the nation's innovation sector job growth during the years 2005 to 2017. So that's not to say that there wasn't new tech jobs in new places. Arithmetically, that's true. But in terms of shares of the overall national industry, there's a very intense concentration. And meanwhile, you can see a lot of red there. A lot of places actually lost innovation jobs in absolute terms. So some of the hope for rise of the rest, is not really been happening in the last decade as we now sail into maybe harder times. So you get the drift. The innovation game, which resides at the center of the economic game in some people's views, has taken on a pronounced winner-take-most dynamics, which brings us to then why this matters. it's important to say it might not matter, right? All of this might be fine. And in fact, some economists argue that the current hyper-concentrated winner-take-most geography is an optimal one for market-ordained a geographical configuration that maybe maximizes innovation. And yet, I think there's now increased concern among scholars, policymakers, even business people that the nation's geographic polarization is throwing off untenable economic, social, and political costs. And I think the three of us, I think, have been somewhat exercised by, this. We're kind of breaking the glass of the alarm system a little bit here. But so multiple economic, social, and political costs. At the economic end of the equation, the costs of excessive tech concentration are creating serious negative externalities. Most notably, a very troubling sorting of workers has been sending college-educated workers to the star cities, while leaving other metros to make do with thinner talent reserves that ultimately can ensure that they become traps of underdevelopment, that they really actually might not be able to move out of the kind of path that Tim has talked about. Equally concerning, regional divergence has been unfair in social terms. I think we could say that in some ways this is a justice issue in which many people are simply in the wrong place to flourish. And then finally, there are political side effects. I'm not going to belabor this too much, but I think it should at least be contemplated that these trends have exacerbated polarization of other kinds. So geographic polarization can flow into political polarization. So what to do, and by whom? Our view has been, that, one shot at this might be to, and very much aligned with Simon's idea, is to launch a nation-led, top-down intervention to help unleash and supplement local activity and potential. It's going to take resources at scale. It's going to require national action and a focus on key promising locations. So our approach is to take maybe a more restrictive, narrower focus on a fairly short list of, selected through competition, maybe 10, 15 places, and launch a big innovation surge on a set of middle-sized metros with major research universities and other attributes that one can detail very much as Simon has done with slightly different indicators. We actually think there are plenty of opportunities out there. This gives a little more detail on our proposal, and we can talk about that. But we think there are plenty of candidates out there for this kind of innovation surge, which would be of benefit to the regions around them as well. So with that, I'll leave off. I think all three of us, think it is time to maybe take a shot at thinking bigger about trying to disrupt very disruptive trends. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark, for your comments and for presenting the data on the hyperconcentration of innovative jobs. You all three have addressed the geography of opportunity prior to COVID and the pandemic. Could you all three comment on how does the pandemic change what you've seen, and the working from home and the new potential for moving away from cities? Does that, in your view, change the future patterns? Will we move away from superstar cities? How do you see current dynamics affecting what Mark and Simon and Tim, you all have laid out in terms of spatial concentration of the past? Tim, do you want to start?
Sure. I guess what I would say, I already said that I think this pandemic will worsen regional disparity by hurting some areas, for example, that specialize in tourism and travel-related industries. So there's going to be increased regional disparity, and even more acute question what we do about it. I also think, though, the current crisis will lead to opportunities. For example, I expect that we're going to see increased investments in healthcare. We're going to see increased investments in domestic manufacturing capacity, particularly in manufacturing capacity related to healthcare. And I think that given the increase in demand for working from home, we'll see calls, which I think are appropriate, for increasing broadband access in many rural areas and small towns, as well as in inner city neighborhoods. So there's potentially some gains that can happen if state and local areas or perhaps the federal government can make investments in moving into some of these growth areas. Let's invest in broadband. Let's invest in developing some additional healthcare assistance capacity. Let's invest in additional manufacturing capacity. And that could perhaps be something that will help some of the current distressed areas as well as those that are becoming distressed because of COVID-19.
Simon, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Susan, obviously, and I think it's clearly too early to be sure. Tim makes some very good points. I think within large metropolitan areas, we have to balance the fact that people won't go to the office as much if they don't have to, with the fact they may need to go, once or twice or some number of times per week. They may not want to travel on mass transit as much. That's going to have some implications. How far are they willing to drive? We will see. I do think this idea of manufacturing getting reshored and manufacturing around healthcare, for example, is a very, very good and important point. I think there's a real opportunity for some strategic guidance by the federal government there. And I think that could be done helpfully. In my conversations with venture capitalists, which are mostly around testing and diagnostics for COVID-19 currently, they still seem to have the preference for investing locally. Now, there are technologies and places that could do well in that space away from the East and West Coast. I can't say yet that we're seeing significant big pushes for investment there. I'm seeing things on the East Coast and the West Coast, actually, Susan.
Thank you. Mark?
Yeah. I am willing to entertain and, in fact, hope there is some decentralization. I think it would be good for the country and good for our innovation and economic system to discover more of the possibilities of more places. But I think there are huge concentrating forces that are not relenting. We'll see how things play out. I think a huge driver here is the extreme concentration of technology and innovation and economies. The platform economy seems to bring with it a kind of concentration in a short list of places. We've been here before. The death of distance doesn't usually materialize, but I think we may see some edgewise rebalancing, and I would think some of that will be local, not at the geographical North American scale that we're thinking about, but we may see movements into nearby regions and suburbs and exurbs. It's an interesting story this week in the Wall Street Journal looking at an uptick in moves into Connecticut out of New York. So some of those things may well happen.
Thank you, Mark. I am now going to turn to the questions that you, the audience, are presenting. And while we may not have a chance to get to all of them, these questions are excellent. Let me start with a broad question on solutions. It's a question: can the panelists describe any case studies representing policy and methods that have proven to be effective in increasing economic participation and equity? So I think this is a question for more specificity on what has worked and how that is shaping your policies going forward.
Well, maybe I'll
like to start. Go ahead.
I'll start. So I guess first I would say that if you target areas with higher non-employment rates, local labor markets, you automatically will get more jobs going to non-employed in those areas than if you don't. The second thing is, I think that if you actually link up your economic development programs with workforce development programs, you'll get much better results on both ends. In other words, you can as part of your economic development projects, you can include a customized training component where you'll train workers for those jobs in the firms receiving incentives. And for that matter, you can invest in workforce development more systematically. I think there are some workforce development programs around the country, like Project Quest, for example, in San Antonio, that if they target jobs in demand in the local economy, can be extraordinarily effective in raising earnings for a wide variety of groups. I think we need to get serious in this country about linking up economic development and workforce development. These programs need to be talking to each other. They should be separate silos, and we need to simultaneously invest in both of them.
Thank you
I could just
for
add,
that.
Susan.
Go ahead, Simon. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tim's right. A lot of it is about education, and in our book we have some success stories where people invested sufficiently in education tied to the local jobs, and some other places where Orlando, Florida, where all things went well, but they regret they didn't invest more in support of education, I think is a fair summary. Representative Ro Khanna has some legislation, I think it's bipartisan support at this stage, trying to make more investments in training along the lines that Tim is talking about, not only for local jobs, but also looking for opportunities to connect across geographies. So this was pre-COVID, the original idea, but you could see the appeal is even more now. So to what extent can we develop software, back office development capabilities in places that are relatively not connected geographically to Silicon Valley? So I think that's a very fertile set of ideas to explore.
Thank you. Broadband, workforce development. Mark, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll throw in, and it's sort of implied by things that Tim, Simon, and I have all said. You know, there's almost nothing as well evaluated as technology-based investment with tech transfer out of universities, which just remains an important driver. And I think with the new generation of better linked universities that are truly taking social inclusion important seriously, I think that remains something that we can bank on, which is one reason we chose that as a place to start with in trying to increase investments.
Here is a question that goes directly to the impact of innovation across the world, actually, is on job markets where innovation is replacing people, and I believe even more so in response to COVID. So these innovations through machines and robots are only going to increase over time. How does that affect your proposals? Who wants to start?
I'll take that one, because that was sort of the premise of our book, which is the question is absolutely right. Innovation left to its own devices, the information technology type innovation we've seen over the past 30 to 40 years is absolutely central to the growing labor force polarization that we've seen, so the hollowing out of the middle. And our response is, don't try to block that technology, don't retreat from it, because I don't think those things are going to work. Invest more in new basic science that creates brand new industries. The biotech industry, for example, the genomics part of it certainly came out of the Human Genome Project, which was a large federal government investment over about 15 years that's generated 300,000 well-paying jobs. So look for opportunities to go big. And certainly, you know, to the points that Tim's been making, look for opportunities to encourage labor-intensive work that can remain in the United States, whatever the pattern of global trade is that coming out of this particular crisis. So I think we should charge faster at the technology of the future, Susan, in order to confront this difficult legacy of the previous generation of technology that's been created and that's still being created. There's obviously that automation process continues around us.
Charge ahead. Go ahead, Mark.
Susan, I'll jump in. So I think building off what Simon said, productivity growth remains a prerequisite. It won't guarantee, but it's a prerequisite for inclusive growth and broadly shared growth. So you have to, I think, embrace technology, but you have to bend it towards actual inclusion. And I think specifying that maybe these kinds of innovation flows focus on, in part, on innovation that is innovations in human-centric automation, for instance, or human.
Tell us more. I'm sorry, please. If you expand upon that, Mark, what do we mean by human-centered innovation?
Well, actually, in technologies that support actual labor-intensive innovation and that are actually creating and supporting the human productivity.
And I suppose the workforce development to train and support in that area. May I go on to put together 3 questions for all of you? And let me start with this one. If the goal is equity and recovery and solution involves moving tech jobs to new locations, how do we make those jobs and economic opportunity available in Black and Latinx communities that are disproportionately affected by COVID-19? Do any of the proposals address the digital divide? And let me add to that a related question. Tim mentioned that block grants can help to support growth in distressed labor markets, but there's a lot of criticism of empowerment zones, centered on how the block grants fuel displacement and gentrification. How can we use block grants effectively to grow labor markets without these effects? And then the third one, COVID-19 exposed racial and economic inequities, and recovery has to account for these disparities. So shouldn't we support a community economic development approach that both values local assets while seeking better jobs? So who would like to take on these 3, all going to disparate opportunity, particularly racial opportunity for Black and Latinx communities?
Let me jump in and mention a few things with maybe some examples. So I guess the issue is that they're concerned about in particular is that either tech jobs or whatever jobs we're creating may not be accessible to persons of color or to other disadvantaged folks. And what do we do about that? First of all, I think we need to note that there are multiplier effects of these jobs that are created in other industries, and that changes the picture a little bit. Secondly, I think we can, through policy, try to link, as I've already mentioned, link up these economic development with workforce development. So what do I mean by an example of that? So for example, Virginia, in attracting the Amazon plant, they gave out a cash incentive, not particularly large compared to what other places offered Amazon, but still they gave out considerable cash. But then they also announced that as part of the Amazon project, they were putting a new campus of George Mason in Northern Virginia. They were upgrading their computer science curriculum at community colleges and state universities around the state. They were upgrading their technology and computer science curriculum at the K-12 area. So in other words, they were trying to send a message that maybe students from throughout the area, throughout the state, should be upgrading their skills in computer-related areas so that they can access some of the tech jobs that Amazon will create in Northern Virginia. And of course, even if this project doesn't turn out to be as many jobs as Amazon originally promised, this would also help prepare students for jobs in other companies as well. So
maybe just let me stop here and come back to all 3 of you, and to you as well, Tim, because we have another question that is quite related to what you're speaking about right now. How do you address the disparity in types of jobs as a result of economic development? Beyond growing jobs in tech or jobs with different degree requirements, is there a thought to economic development with a lens towards equity in the types of jobs created? And I think that's what you're speaking of, Tim.
Well, yeah, and I think to some extent, another way to answer this is, and this kind of gets back to the previous question, the tech economy is generating tremendous amount of profits and income for people. One thing in a way we're all debating is how do we can create sufficient jobs for everyone if we're able to recycle some of those funds into in more creative ways. So everything we're involving here is talking about public investment in different services. I mean, Simon's talking a lot about investing in R&D. We're talking about investing in broadband around the country. We're talking about creating tech hubs. There are going to be a lot of construction jobs involved here. There's going to be there's technician jobs, all kinds of jobs.
Let me stop there, because again, so many different questions, and come back to this, Mark and Simon, also if you can. But I want to throw out there, before we're coming to a close, a very important issue, which is that I'll read it. Although I agree that there would be benefit to bring people to job centers, I think that approach ignores the severe affordability crisis, housing affordability crisis, that is impacting these hubs like San Francisco and New York City. Can the panelists please address this? I think the question's point is, well, even if you move to another 100, as Simon, you suggest, or another 10, 15, as you suggest, Mark, won't the housing affordability problem then increase there, so that, again, there is a lack of ability to move to where jobs are? What is your view on that? May I start with you, Simon?
I can, oh, okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, either, go ahead.
Okay, I'll just say one quick thing. And I mean, to several of these questions, I think the answer is for federal intervention to ask for certain results in some cases. You know, inclusion is actually explicit in a bill that is emerging, the Endless Frontier bill that is circling in Congress. It actually explicitly requires social inclusion plans be developed around. And I think the same thing goes for place more broadly. The nation can ask for in targeting funding certain outcomes, development of plans, development of priorities. And I think the government's been a little too diffident about some of these things. There are other possible endings to the story than, you know, insane superheating of 5 places.
Yeah, I agree completely. These are conscious decisions these decisions that we're making, conscious or unconscious, and it's good to make them more consciously. And I think people asking these questions, Susan, are pushing in the right direction. I would just like to say 3 things, and then I'm afraid that I have to leave. The one is, I think, to the prior question, public health. I think it's never been clearer that good health, which means good public health, which means access to affordable medicine, is a prerequisite. It's necessary, even if it's not sufficient, for prosperity. And so when people are very unhealthy, it's extremely hard to get any of these positive dynamics going. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of minority communities right now. The question about housing affordability, of course, is really important, both in San Francisco type situations, but also in these potential areas. You know, if land is available for economic development, and if people are willing to expand or increase the density of housing, then that's a very different scenario from what we're experiencing and what's being observed in the Bay Area, for example. So I think one of the criteria that we propose is space for development and a willingness and a coalition of local partners willing to increase the number of people and increase the housing available, because then you won't drive up housing prices in the same way. And then finally on inclusion, I think Mark's exactly right, and I do commend the Endless Frontiers bill to everyone, and I'll tell, Mark is a shy person, so I'll tell you that Mark has had a great influence on this, and thank you, Mark, for that. And I hope Tim is also can become at least moderately happy with it. I'm sure Tim has very high standards, which we aspire to meet. It's a pretty tough goal there, Tim. But anyway, I think that pressing your elected representatives on this point about how do we include people, how do we make sure that we build something that really does create opportunity across everyone possible in American society, I think that's not only a reasonable request, I think it's absolutely essential. And now's the moment, because there is going to be some rebuilding one way or another. Do you want to have a future built with more inclusivity? If so, articulate that, press that locally, press that at the state level, and get your representatives in Congress to look at the Endless Frontiers bill and see which way they can twist it or tweak it or affect the outcomes down the road. I think it's all in play right now, Susan, and I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to engage with your audience on these issues today.
Well, let me thank you, all 3 of you, for these comments and for your excellent work and your continuing work, if I may say so. And let me also thank the audience for joining us today. And let me remind the audience that the recording of today's webinar will be available at the Philadelphia Federal Reserve website and the Penn Institute for Urban Research website. And you will also be receiving an evaluation form. Please fill it out. We want your suggestions on future topics and how to improve the series. Also, please join us on July 30th at noon for the third in the series, a webinar on small businesses. And once again, thank you to the panelists and to all of you for joining us. Thank you.